also in that plot are her parents. And it turns out, and none of this my mother knew probably, I certainly didn't know it, but it turns out that her parents were Quakers and that they formed one of the first Cuban ministries for Quakers. I always thought, oh, it was Hiram Hilty because that's the person I knew, and Hiram's in the book too, but it was really her family that had done a lot of work with the Cuban Quakers. So that was really interesting. And also, when I started in looking for her name and everything, we always knew her as Evelyn Hallworth, but she had a different name entirely from birth, and she made Evelyn out of Eva and something else. Let's see, Eva Evelyn. She was Eva Evelyn Martin, and she turned it into Evelyn. But it was her parents, the Martins, who were so active. Samuel, just married into this Quaker family. But they were really interesting, and I'm kind of, for both of those families, I feel like it's an honor to my mother and my parents that I did those two ones, and I did several others, but I hope you enjoyed reading the book. We had a ball doing it, we really did, and I feel like we have a nice book here.
I will mention that another person in there, non-Quaker but with Quaker ancestry, Skipper Bowles. Many of you know that, the politician Skipper Bowles. He made it in because he dated Gertrude's mother. And for other reasons too. But indeed, hanging out with dead people is about as much fun as Quakers are allowed. It was fun writing about them. Let's open up for any questions you may have. Yeah.
What number, does anyone have an idea what number of people are buried in this cemetery who have no history, have no written marker or anything like that?
We have the records.
Yeah.
And Quakers kept really good records because we were illegal. And so to record our marriages and deaths and things, we had to keep very good records ourselves. So you can, if you talk with Hayes Ratledge, he knows exactly where every person is buried there. There are a few, though, that we can't locate. We know that Richard Williams, for example, is buried there, but we don't know exactly where his grave is because he was in the era when they weren't marked. And for whatever reason, you can't find his record. And he's pretty significant because he owned a huge tract of land, farmland, that's now the Guilford College campus, that is now Harris Teeter, and just about everything on the south side of Friendly. His daughter was Levi Coffin's mother. Levi Coffin, the president of the Underground Road, who's spent his first 28 years in this community. And quite famously, he sold the property for the graveyard in 1757, 53 acres that makes up the graveyard and the meeting house property, and about half of which is now Harris Teeter and Quaker Village. And in March 15, 1781, the second skirmish of the Battle of New Garden, preceding the Battle of Guilford Horsehouse, was fought around the meeting house and on their farmland, on Levi Coffin's grandparents' farm next door to theirs. And in aiding a British Army officer who had fallen in the skirmishes, Richard Williams contracted smallpox and died, and is buried there somewhere, we know, close to the Revolutionary Oak, which is also featured in the book. You can always tell a Quaker graveyard, we've got gravestones for trees. And yet we don't know where exactly he is.
So how many unmarked graves do you have?
A lot, dozens of them. They're in the middle. If you take the tour, there's this huge open expanse in the middle, just a few stones, but there are dozens and dozens in there. Two of them, again, we don't have records for, but we know are somewhere in there, probably pretty close to Randall Jarrell, who's also, any of you take courses with Randall Jarrell at Women's College or read his poetry or his essays, he's there. Two Union soldiers are buried. There are 3 Union veterans buried in our Quaker cemetery. One of them, John Van Lindley, who joined the Missouri Cavalry of the Union Army as a Quaker from New Garden because of his anti-slavery stance, then came back as a successful businessman. He's the person who introduced peaches to the Sandhills. And he's the person that PTI is located on, Old Lindley Field, and the Arboretum was his nursery, and all kinds of other stuff. But there are also two other Union soldiers buried there in unmarked graves that we don't know their whereabouts. They escaped a Confederate prison, made their way out to the Quaker community, and two physicians there, one of them, Nereus Mendenhall, attended to them but couldn't save them. They died and were buried there in the Quaker cemetery. Other questions, or if you've read the book, things that you're questioning?
Who currently does the upkeep at the cemetery?
The New Garden Cemetery Association contracts with a person to maintain it. So it's not overgrown like several other Quaker cemeteries in the area, but it's nicely maintained. And the Cemetery Association has an endowment that guarantees that that's going to be taken care of for quite some time. And it's inevitable that whenever I do a tour, they are maintaining the cemetery. New placards are going on while I'm trying to talk to the folk.
And
Yeah.
I was a minute late. How do people find out about when the tours are?
Well, there are two that you can count on. One is Halloween night at 8 o'clock. It's a lantern-led tour, and we usually have 12 to 15 people who represent some of the moldering old Quakers there, folk from the college or from the meeting. And it's a lot of fun. If any of you want to do that, and you pick out your favorite character in the book, just let me know. M. Carter at guilford.edu, and I'll be glad to give you a script and do it. It lasts about an hour and 45 minutes. And is a lot of fun. I was telling someone earlier on that it ends with a bunch of free coffee from Starbucks, because the last grave we visit is a Starbucks. With all those coffee names are there, Starbucks and Folgers, all those coffee folk from Nantucket. And there's a little bit about the Folgers coffee in there in the book too. And then there's another one on Memorial Day. We do a Memorial Day tour at 10 o'clock in the morning. As you can expect, a Memorial Day tour of a Quaker cemetery is slightly different. We hit all, there are a lot of Army veterans buried there, not just more recently, when the Quaker testimony on peace and avoidance of war became a matter of individual conscience rather than a uniform testimony. But I don't think this is included in the story, in the book, but William Armfield was in the New Garden community when the battles of 1781 were taking place. And for weeks before, the competing armies, the British and the Americans, were foraging the farms all around the place. You had 2,500 soldiers to feed, so they just ransacked these farms. William Armfield was not amused by this. In the morning of the battles, got up from breakfast, picked up his hunting rifle, and headed out the door, and his wife asked him, "Where's he going?" "Well, I'm going hunting." And off he went, and later on that day, came back, having clearly seen some action, and his wife said, as he put his gun back up on the rack, "Well, dear, where's thy games?" "Well, I didn't shoot anything worth bringing home." And there was that, and then later on in the Civil War, you've got these three Union veterans in the cemetery. And then quite famously, and there's a historical marker about this out on Friendly Avenue, Mary Nicholson is buried there. How many of you know the story of Mary Nicholson? She's in there. She was North Carolina's first commercial female pilot. Learned how to fly in the 1920s, and was recruited by Amelia Earhart to head up one of the auxiliaries of the 99s, the licensed female pilots in America in the 1930s, and then was recruited to ferry airplanes for the RAF during World War II from factories to the airfields to free up pilots to, fight the Luftwaffe. And in 1943, the engine of her plane seized up, and she hit a stone English barn and was killed. And body brought back, and she's buried there. And one of the fascinating things is she's in the same row, several graves down, from a mass grave of the Knight family. How many of you know that story? The Knight family, members of New Garden, had a farmhouse out on Old Oak Ridge Road. And in September of 1943, a Navy pilot ferrying an airplane from the factory to the airfield crashed into their farmhouse and killed 4 members of the family. They're in the same row with Mary Nicholson, who died the same year under the same circumstances. It's just one of those uncanny sorts of things. So there are those on Memorial Day, but all these other fighters for civil rights and peace, and that's 10 o'clock on Memorial Day morning. Yeah, Lloyd.
What are the limitations on burial for non-Quakers?
Supposedly you've got to have some connection. And it seems that it can be very, very distant. Jack Jensen's buried there, and his only connection is really because he taught at Guilford. And Randy Doss pulled strings. But Hayes Ratledge and the Cemetery Association can give you the information of what the restriction. You're supposed to have some Quaker connection or some relative. And again, like Vance Havner married a former Quaker, and that got him in there. Yeah.
Where is Ed Lowe buried?
Not there. Do you know where he is? New York, Gertrude says. Yeah, Ed Lowe was a wonderful choir director at Guilford for many, many years, and died in Munich during a study abroad. That was not a good year at Guilford. We lost, I think, 4 people that year. Ed Lowe, Herb Poole, Betty Placeberry, Larry West. Not a good year. 1999. Yeah. Other questions or yeah?
Are there any Confederates buried out there? Snuck in the back door somehow?
Not that I